I was 17 years old when the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989. And growing up, I think many of us always had the assumption that the Soviet Union would be the eternal enemy of the United States and the Enlightenment ideals upon which it was founded. So it was astounding in 1990 and 1991 to see the Soviet Union begin to unravel. It was as if democracy and freedom had somehow magically prevailed over darker forces, perhaps permanently. And in fact, it led some commentators, most notably Francis Fukuyama, a Stanford professor, to state at that time that we were witnessing the end of history. Well, in fact, nothing could be really further from the truth. In the early 1990s, after this unraveling, Russia faced a huge problem, which was how to bring into the private sector its over 225,000 state-owned enterprises. So for help, they turned to Harvard University and the United States, and specifically a group within Harvard called the Harvard Institute for International Development. And they put in charge a group of elite economists, most specifically Andrei Schleifer, and it was also overseen by Lawrence Summers. Lawrence Summers, you may know, went on to be president of Harvard, and then later the US Treasury Secretary. And in this capacity, these economists had tremendous insights into what was going to be privatized, when it was going to be privatized, and on what terms. And because they had this knowledge, they were in a position to profit from this mightily. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. Schleifer's wife, Nancy Zimmerman, set up a hedge fund, and this whole group started to profit very, very handsomely from the activity happening in Russia. So as you can imagine, this didn't go over terribly well, but in fact, when it all began to unravel in 1996 over ethics concerns, all that really happened was folks got a slap on the wrist and said, don't do that again. There weren't any real long-term consequences. So, in fact, Andrei Schleifer still teaches at Harvard. This is not a Harvard bashing talk. I know where I am. But the point is that throughout this exercise, Harvard was supposed to be teaching Russia how to build rule of law and to build democratic norms around a private economy. And what we in fact taught them how to do was to build a kleptocracy. And we also taught them that when you do things that are wrong under rule of law, there may not actually be consequences. So fast forward to 2014. This is a map that I made of my hometown, Baltimore, Maryland. And it's a map of the Twitter users in Baltimore. Each dot represents a user, and each line represents a friend or follow relationship between them. And what you can derive from this kind of a map is a kind of fractional distillation of all of the different little communities within a given city. So I'm kind of on this end over here where the geeks are and the TEDx and that sort of thing. And it shows you how distant I am from the folks on the other end, which mostly tend to be younger African American folks. So I looked at this kind of capacity and this capability and said, this is an amazing opportunity to do good for the world. We can inform urban planning. We can figure out how to end segregation in communities. We can do all these wonderful things to improve cities like Boston or Baltimore. But a different cast of characters looked at that same capability and said, there's other stuff that we could do with this. So Russia looked at this and said, oh, wow, this could help us extend and enhance our historical program of active measures, which is intended to corrode and otherwise hinder the operation of democracy. Extremist groups, both on the left and the right, looked at this and said, this is a way to inflame people and to get people at each other's throats. Social media companies looked at this, like Facebook and Twitter, and said, this is a terrific opportunity to profit. We can sell ads. We can even let people pay for them in rubles. How exciting is that? And then there's another company that came out of this, which was Cambridge Analytica, which you've heard a lot about. And Cambridge Analytica looked at this as an opportunity to basically be a mercenary shop to destroy democracies on contract. So and this was taking root all over Europe. You can see some of the examples of different political parties, both on the left and the right, throughout Europe that kind of signed on to this program. And so the big question that people have around Cambridge Analytica is simply, did it work and how did it work if it did? So to kind of understand how it works, you need to understand what they claim to have been doing. What they claimed to be able to do was to assign every individual on a social media platform or another data set an OCEAN personality score. OCEAN stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And they can rank you on like each of those scales on a score from like 0 to 100. So the idea was that if you could sort of identify like who's the most neurotic and has all these different kinds of characteristics, you would be able to target those people and get them to behave in different ways. So this is actually a slide from a deck that was put together by SCL, which was the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. So you may wonder where it came from. SCL is a military psyops firm that was employed in Afghanistan. And this is a dashboard that they put together to try to target young unmarried males. So it gives you some sense of like the very fine degree of control that was possible in terms of addressing specific audiences. And they basically turned this onto our Western liberal democracies. And so in terms of how this actually works in practice, what they would do is develop several different types of messaging depending on what the personality type was. So this is just 3 of 12 different messages that were developed for the John Bolton Super PAC. And of course, John Bolton is now the National Security Advisor. And you can see each of these YouTube videos was targeted to like a different type of personality. So there's some people that might be interested in like being concerned about Islamic terrorism or whatever. There's other people that might be responding to a message around military service and tradition. And then there's other folks that might be sort of more swayed by like a more rational kind of chemistry-based argument, So they had something for everybody. And then what they would do is target these things at each of these little micro-audiences. So, the real question, is really, did this actually work? Well, so the people paying for it seem to think it works. So this is a tweet from Aaron Banks, who was one of the main funders behind Brexit. And the thing to know is that Brexit and the Trump thing and all of it is tied together. It's the same operation. And so basically they said that 0.97% of the population determined the result of that particular referendum question. It was just 650,000 people that made the difference. So could you make a difference of 650,000 people with those kinds of numbers feeding into it and the ability to manipulate people's behavior? So I have an unfortunate truth for you. Most of us tend to think that we're rational people and that we make rational decisions based on the inputs that we receive and that we can't be so easily swayed and all of that. And maybe that's true for each of us individually. But the fact of the matter is that we behave a lot more like ants. If you can start to manipulate people as a population and in a collective way, you can have a lot of power over how they operate. And that's kind of the mindset that was employed with this Cambridge Analytica thing. So to really demonstrate this, I did what anybody would, and I made a mathematical model and put it into an animation so that you could really understand some of how this worked. And again, this is just really an illustration. It's not what I would consider to be scientifically accurate, because the bottom line is we can't really know what these social media companies are doing to some extent. But if each one of these dots here is a user, and each line is a friend relationship, and these little activated colors are news stories that are passing through the network, this is what a relatively healthy network looks like. Stories are kind of moving around. Nothing particularly awful is happening, and you can get a sense of how information just sort of disperses through it. But what starts to get to be interesting is when we start to inject what you might call fake news. Now, fake news might be also described as like toxic content, or things that are purposely geared at dividing people, by spreading false messages or inflammatory messages. And you can see that as you start to inject these kinds of divisive stories into the network, it starts to actually affect the network. So like friend relationships break. Have you ever had the experience of seeing something from a friend and you're like, I can't take this anymore, you unfriend somebody? That's the kind of thing that you start to see here. And you also see specific actors that are sharing certain kinds of stories, changing their position in the network. Now, what really starts to be crazy is when you put this onto kind of steroids that are made possible by this psychographic, personality-based targeting. And when you target people this way, you have massive effects on the network very quickly, because you know exactly who is going to respond and in what way to the stories that you're sharing with them. So you can make really, really rapid changes in the topology of the network by injecting that kind of content into it. And that is effectively what I believe and what other researchers believe we've been experiencing since like 2014, 2015 in the United States, as we've seen that social media has had a huge impact on our political discourse. So when it's all kind of said and done, you end up with this very sick, kind of ailing network that has a lot fewer connections in it than it used to have. It makes it a lot harder for real content, good quality news, to actually traverse and get to all the different nodes. That's the same number of nodes, it's just less connected. So that's kind of scary to think about. But a thing to think about when you analyze a model like that is what actually happened. Like, what changed? And so were anybody's minds changed? Did anybody say like, oh, I was going to vote for this person, but now I'm going to vote for a different person? Not really. That's not the nature of the kind of change that these people were hoping to achieve. The kind of change that they were hoping to achieve is exactly what I said about not spreading good information, about breaking people apart, about creating more extreme and divisive kind of camps of thought. And so what that also does is when you sort of run all that data on the network, it trains the algorithms about what people want to see. It trains the algorithms for what everyone wants to see. So it starts to get a distorted idea about what normal is within society. And that's perhaps the most toxic aspect of this entire approach. And it's something that the social media companies are taking almost no responsibility for fixing. So, there's a bit of a moral leadership problem in Silicon Valley, and I say that not to chastise anyone in particular, but there are some parallels with the situation in Russia in the early 1990s that we can draw here. So, it turns out that Sheryl Sandberg's mentor was Lawrence Summers. Mark Zuckerberg was at Harvard under Lawrence Summers. There's kind of a ethos that if you are elite enough and you can kind of get away with it, then the rules maybe don't apply to you. Because Facebook has been making the argument that they don't really need any regulation, that everything is just fine. You don't need to monitor us, everything is good. But the fact of the matter is that they've created a huge problem for the world, as well as doing some great good. But on July 25th, 2018, Facebook's market valuation dropped by $120 billion, the single biggest drop for a private company or a public company in history. Just 2 days ago, Facebook was fined £500,000 by the UK Information Commissioner's Office for the Cambridge Analytica scandal. That's £500,000 for accidentally breaking Western democracy. Is that right? I don't think that that's good. So, we have these other Silicon Valley leaders, some of whom are, I think, mostly good people, some of whom are maybe not so good people. But at the end of the day, when we start to put profits and money ahead of our values and ahead of what we need as a society and ahead of people, we'll be led astray. And I think that we need to have a renewed call for moral leadership in the context of Silicon Valley. So there are always going to be times, all of us here are the builders and leaders of our own organizations. There's always going to be times when we think that there's a big inflection point, that change is happening in the world, this time is different, and that it's the end of history. The old rules don't apply. Well, I think we've learned through enough of this kind of experience throughout history, but especially in our recent history, that it's just not true. All of us are called to constantly reevaluate our values against what we're doing in our organizations and to make sure that we're doing the right thing and putting people ahead of profits, that we're watching out for the consequences of engineering and generally watching out for society's needs. So I call on you to really ask yourselves, as you lead your organizations and do your work, are we being responsible? Are we setting a good example? Are we potentially being naive? And are we holding ourselves accountable to those we claim to serve? Because at the end of the day, this really is about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where there's special rules for the elite and that some people get to do one thing and others don't, and we don't worry about the consequences? Or do we want to live in a world where there's equality and justice for all? I know what kind of world that I'd like to live in. Do you? Thank you.